Yes, my name is Steve Morris. I'm the executive director of Favarh. We're a provider organization in Connecticut. We're funded by the Department of Developmental Services, or DDS, as we refer to them in Connecticut. Favarh is a local ARC. We're one of about 12 in Connecticut. We have about 325 people that we support with IDD throughout a multi-town region. The PowerPoint that we're going to present now is kind of divided into two sections. The first part I'll do, which is more of the provider perspective, and then Ken will take over with some of his slides and talk to you about the developer side of it. And one thing to keep in mind throughout is that the reason this works is because it's a partnership between the developer and the provider, and that's what makes it unique and special.
Sure.
So I thought I'd start off by giving just a little bit of a timeline about the history of apartment supports at Favarh, which pretty much mirrors the history in Connecticut. I was mentioning to Lori earlier that group homes have been the main community living option since institutions started closing down in Connecticut. And group homes are very expensive. And that's one of the reasons the apartment model is so appealing right now, but it's actually been around for quite a while. Favarh opened its first apartment building, or first apartment supports back in 1984. And back then, when we were supporting somebody, we would place somebody in one apartment building in one town, and the next person who wanted to live in an apartment, we might place them in a whole different town. Or in a different part of town, in a different apartment complex, all with the intention of integrating them into the community. It took us 22 years to realize that what we were doing in many cases was isolating people in those different apartments. And so in 2006, we tried what we call in Connecticut our first cluster apartment. And by that, we mean where we have a group of individuals at the same complex. And so we had a few people in a complex in Avon called Old Farms Crossing, and we decided to start moving more people into that complex. And we quickly discovered that there were lots of advantages that occurred. There was shared staffing resources, there was shared transportation, and there was a built-in peer network that really was probably the most prominent feature. People liked having a larger group of peers to choose who they wanted to hang out with. In 2015, that's when Ken and I met. And Ken was building a project in Simsbury called Ojakian Commons. And it was something that he referred to at the time as specialty housing. And by that, it was an apartment complex that was designed for a particular group. And in this case, people with MS. And in the process of designing and building and getting that project approved, the town of Simsbury asked him to set aside some of the apartments for people with different disabilities. And so that's how we met. Ken set aside 7 or 8 of the apartments for Favarh folks with IDD. And Ken and I quickly started talking about doing something very similar, but for people with IDD. In other words, designing the apartment complex for people with IDD, but instead of making the entire complex that way, as this one was for people with MS, we wanted to make it integrated. And Ken mentioned that he was doing some similar things in New Jersey and New York. And so later that year, we put in a proposal to DDS in Connecticut for a supportive housing project. And just a year later, they came out with some funding to support that very idea. They called it IDASH funding for intellectual disability autism spectrum housing. The autism spectrum housing part never really materialized because at the time, autism services were within DDS, but before the project got off the ground, it was moved to a different department. So the IDASH funding is really for just for people with IDD. So we applied for a project in Canton. We got a little bit of pushback because it was a little bit more remote, not remote by New Hampshire standards, perhaps, but The folks at Connecticut DDS didn't think there was enough public transportation, so we found another location in Bloomfield with better public transportation. And we're ready to present that when this IDASH funding came out, and we said, well, let's present them both. Let's apply for both. They're both ready. And lo and behold, we got them both approved. I think Ken was happy and I was panicked because 2 projects at once was a little scary. But we did it. And the first one opened in 2021, Bear Woods in Canton. The second one opened just this past summer, Lavender Fields in Bloomfield. And these last 2 are what we officially call supportive housing. Now, supportive housing has different definitions and people look at it different ways. And so I want to tell you a little bit about how in Connecticut, we look at it differently and how it works specifically at DDS and at Favarh. First, let's start with the Department of Housing in Connecticut. They define supportive housing as permanent, affordable housing and support services. And those support services can range in intensity to meet the need of the tenant to ensure housing stability. So a very broad general definition, which applies slightly differently to a lot of different state divisions, agencies, and departments. So you can see here that within the Department of Housing, there's a supportive housing director that works with the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, the Department of Children and Family Services, and various other agencies and divisions, including DDS. And so there's somebody at DDS that works with a supportive housing director, and supportive housing looks a little differently depending on which agency is putting it together. As you would imagine, with that broad general definition that the Department of Housing has, DDS defines supportive housing this way. On the programmatic side, it needs to be affordable. It also needs to be permanent in that people need to have a place to age in place and stay there as long as they want. They haven't come up with a minimum size development yet, but that's probably going to be happening. Our experience at Favarh is that to make the economies of scale work, we need at least 12 residents, and some of our apartments have as many as 22. And I think some of Ken's and other states have many more because the complexes are much bigger. And then they need to be integrated. So no more than 25% of the total apartments can be set aside for people with IDD. There need to be on-site support services. Smart home technology needs to be built in so that fewer staff need to spend fewer hours in people's apartments so that people could be more self-sufficient, but at the same time, safety and health can be overseen. The real thing I feel that makes this so unique is it's a collaborative way of bringing together 3 critical funding sources. So the first is capital, which the developer needs to build a project. Rent subsidies are for the landlords to pay the rents. And of course, service dollars pay the providers. So when these 3 sources of funding come together, that really is what makes this work. And why is this so important now? So apartment supports are something that I feel are going to work for most people with IDD. I do feel that group homes are going to be needed forever for people with certain significant disabilities, and they're just not capable of living in an apartment setting. But for many, many people, an apartment setting with staff supports on site can work. The problem is the vacancy rate for apartments is very low. And in order to get that critical number, as I mentioned, 12 people to make it work financially, you can't find that many vacancies. And in Connecticut, we have the lowest vacancy rate of any state right now. And this is just back in August. So if we're going to make apartments supports work in Connecticut, we've got to design and build them. And so that's why supportive housing is so critical right now. So what does this look like in Connecticut, and how has Favarh and Regan Development meant work together. So we've got these two projects. The one on the top is the Canton Bear Woods complex, and the one on the bottom is Bloomfield Lavender Fields. And here are the components that make these a little bit more unique. So again, you go back to the Department of Housing definition, it's very broad. DDS starts to define it a little bit more specifically. And now as the developer and the provider get together, we define it more specifically still. So it's affordable, yes. It's permanent so that people can age in place if they choose. There's a minimum size that's going to make it work. In our case, at least 12 people. It's integrated, no more than 25% of the apartments, on-site staffing, smart home tech. And then here are the other innovations that we've built into these two apartment complexes. We have enhanced accessibility features, and we have some pictures of those later. So things like hard floors throughout for ease of mobility, extra grab bars in the bathroom, roll-in showers, non-clogged toilets, accessible bathrooms, lots of extra accessibility features. At Favarh, we've designed a healthy prepared meal delivery program. We know that as people live more independently, their eating habits tend to get worse, left on their own. And in an apartment setting, we don't have staff to make dinner for everybody every night. We don't have that level of staffing. And wouldn't it be a shame to put all of this effort into helping people live more independently, only to see their health decline because of weight gain? So we work with a local kitchen, and they help us develop and design healthy, balanced, portioned meals that our residents can buy into at an affordable price. And we supplement those to make them affordable. We also have inclusive recreation activities. People who live in apartment complexes sometimes tend to stay isolated in their apartments. So we have to pull them out by creating some cool, fun activities, and we invite everybody, not just the folks that we support. And there's some pictures of that later in the presentation. And then, of course, as I mentioned, all of this is special because it's a collaborative design process. Ken included Favarh. Favarh included our parents, our residents, our staff, and brainstorming about the features that were going to make this work. And we built most of those into these two complexes. So this is Bear Woods. That was a design drawing before. This is the actual thing. This is one of the bedrooms. This is a living room at Bear Woods. These are two brothers that moved into their first apartment together. The gentleman on the right here is the oldest of these three siblings. He moved into this apartment with a roommate. And this is a Saturday where he invited his siblings and his parents over for tea and croissants, it looks like. And no one could be more prouder to be hosting his family in his own apartment for the first time. And here's another resident with her cat. And this is Bloomfield's Lavender Fields. This is the community room. There's also a community room at Bear Woods. We didn't have a picture of it, but this is a space where we can do those integrated activities and invite everybody or have special parties. Ken has built this into the complexes both at our request, and I think he does it anyway, because it just makes sense. This is one of the bedrooms at Lavender Fields. This is the living space, and the kitchen table. This is the kitchen. You'll notice the induction stovetop so that you can't burn yourself on that. And here's the bathroom. And Ken, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you because the next set of slides are yours.
Sure. I think you have one more slide, Steve.
Oh, I do. Yes. Thank you. Oh, I have two more slides, one at the very end and this one. So this is just some press coverage that we've gotten. These are two friends that moved into a an apartment at Lavender Fields. We had a couple move into Bear Woods in 2021. They lived together for a year to see if they could live together successfully. They could, and they got married last May. And they continue to live together. It's really working out well. It's very exciting. And this is Charlie during move-in day into Lavender Fields a couple of months ago. So now, Ken, I will turn it back to you or over to you.
Yeah, and Steve, thank you. So I think, Steve gave you a very quick overview of the service side of what we're talking about, which is integrated apartments for people with IDD, integrated into a larger building. Both of the buildings that we're talking about fit a good model for financing in the state of Connecticut from the housing side, in addition to what Steve was talking about with the Department of Developmental Services, DDS. And I think one of the key things that we've tried to do both here in Connecticut and in other places where we've done integrated housing for people with IDD is to use the resources that your state has for affordable housing. Every state in the country has programs, in this case through New Hampshire HFA and other state programs that work for affordable housing. And what we try and do is piggyback those funds with the service side dollars that may be available. And as Steve said, the rental assistance that was available in both of these cases to create housing in a way that we're not really reinventing the whole wheel. We're just looking to put together resources in a way that can be successful for the place where we're building it. These two buildings are roughly about 40 units each. One is 38 and one is 40 apartments, of which 9 units in one of the buildings and 10 units in the other building is specifically set aside for supportive housing for people with IDD. Those were the units that Steve was talking about. One of the most beautiful things about this model is that there are 75%, meaning the other units, that are available for people who just need affordable housing in the community. And as you all know, just pretty much everywhere in the country, it's become very difficult to find affordable rental housing. So what we're trying to do is sort of put together the existing resources that a state might have for affordable housing and layer in some additional resources for this population so the population can be successful in an independent setting. And we've done that in New York, we've done that in New Jersey, we've done that here in Connecticut. And it's a very successful model because it's something that states are used to seeing. And at the same time, we're putting together a situation which creates independence with support for the people who need it most. And it's really a wonderful thing. Steve, I'm going to ask you just to go to the next slide. I think as we're thinking about how to successfully create this model for New Hampshire, one of the things that Steve mentioned, and I think deserves repeating, is that this was a real joint effort among the DDS, where you see up on the screen now, the Favarh, which is the ARC of the Farmington Valley, the developer, which is my company, and importantly, the Connecticut Housing Finance Agency, the HFA there, as well as the Department of Housing, all came together to try and meet this goal to create independent housing for people who need a little bit of support, but otherwise can live independently. And it's been something that's been very attractive to a lot of the state agencies because it helps save money on the Medicaid spend. And that's a big issue for a lot of pretty much every state agency that works with Medicaid. With everything being crunched down and budgets becoming tighter, this is a way that we can create independent housing for people that is well supported, but at the same time save money on the Medicaid side. And that's really something that I think DDS found to be attractive. They actually used a lot of the savings, or in the process of using the savings, to create more housing and services opportunities for other people that might not have been able to be helped, but for the fact that we're basically taking a very high intensity staffing situation and providing some savings to that, but at the same time providing independence. Steve, you can go to the next slide. couple of the things that we look at from my company that really are a little bit different than your typical affordable housing developer or certainly your typical market rate developer is that you need to understand the populations that you're working with. The management of a building with this population brings with it a little bit of extra issues that come up, whether it be in the integration of people or just helping people to learn to live independently. We have to make sure that our staff understands that this is not a plain vanilla housing development where people are just working and at the same time paying their what hopes to be reduced rent. It's a situation where you need to address the special needs of the populations that you're assisting. And so we work very hard with our management staff to make sure we're getting people in there that understand that this is not just your collect the rent, make sure the maintenance is done on the building, which we of course do, but more importantly, we're able to sort of work through issues both with the residents themselves and with the service agencies that are supporting those residences. One of the things that we talked about a little bit, that Steve talked about, is the community spaces in a building like this are really important, more so that we can have a really good integration among the populations that are living there. Steve is modest and said, "Oh, we like to include everybody from the building," but this is something that a service agency like Favarh has been extremely successful at. When they do music, when they do cooking, when they do art, different things or programming, they always invite everyone from the building, and it becomes a real family atmosphere in the building itself. And it's been something that I'd love to see. We've tried to, after working with Steve for a number of years, we've replicated that feeling on new buildings that we're doing outside of Connecticut and on existing buildings that we have, so that we can have a real community feel. I mean, we talk about integration, but integration is not just putting people in the same location, whether it be an apartment building or a group home or a neighborhood, but integration is really allowing people to socially be involved with each other. The benefits of that are just astounding. And, they get to the point where some of our residents without, that are not special needs residents will take some of the other residents with them shopping and doing kind of things that wouldn't happen without the social activity spaces that we're talking about. And I think it's something that has been very successful. One of the other things that's been successful in terms of creating a really good integrated building is providing, and Steve talked about this a little bit, providing things and features in your apartment that meet the needs of the people who are living in them. So we do, as Steve said, we do like induction cooktops, so that if people are using their stovetops and turn off their stove, it's not forever hot or doesn't take 20 minutes to cool down. So God forbid somebody puts their hand on that stovetop, they're going to be safe. We put in each of the buildings, depending on the people, we don't always know the level of disability of the person who's going to be living in that unit at any given time. So we build in a number of features into the apartments themselves, and we did this based on focus group work that Steve and I did with families, with the architects, with different people from the state agencies to talk about what we thought would be best to have as a baseline in the apartment, so that every time a new person moves in with a differing level of disability, hopefully we've been able to put them into a space that they can be more independent from day one. The middle picture you see here is a Hoyer lift that we put in, although we haven't put in Hoyer lift systems, all of the ceilings are reinforced so that we're able to put that system in at very little cost and just sort of hook it up rather than having to do a huge construction job every time somebody moves into the building. Roll-in showers, Steve mentioned. Those are sort of baseline things, both helpful to the folks with disabilities maybe moving in now, but also helpful on into the future as they may age in place, as we all are aging, and may have needs that change over time. You can keep going, Steve. Steve mentioned some of the smart home technology, and again, he's being modest. He spent tons of time trying to find systems that will make people more able to live on their own and not have staff in their apartment every minute of it. And that really has been extremely successful in the sense that from communication to HVAC controls to lighting controls to automated shades for blinds and shades for windows, all of those things can help cue the management of somebody's day-to-day life when they may not be thinking about something to do that. In addition, there's communication, two-way communication between the office in each of these buildings that is staffed by Favarh staff on a 24/7 basis, but the residents themselves can communicate directly through video conferencing without having to have somebody come into their apartment. Now, if they need to have somebody come into the apartment, the people are right there and in the building, but the whole goal here is to, as much independence as we can foster is really what we're looking for. I think that one of the things I just want to talk for a minute about, and whether it be a developer like me or somebody from New Hampshire that is willing to work with this population, it's, I think, important, and Peggy and Lori we've had this discussion, to partnering with somebody who is experienced with the financing side and the construction side of doing housing is really very important. I've been in this business for over 30 years, and I've seen nonprofit service agencies do this and do this really well. But there is a very steep learning curve at the start to doing that, and you want to be able to be successful right off the bat. So a developer will come in, they'll understand how to get approvals from local communities. They'll understand to work with those communities to meet the goals that they have. The proper location of a site is crucial in a situation like this. We want to make sure that the whole community is excited about what we're doing, and that is something that you don't always get, but when you get it, it works. And when you don't get it, you might as well not start down that road, because it's just not a successful formula. There are developers in your state who do affordable housing. Those are the developers who you may want to reach out to. And certainly we may have an interest, but I'm not the only game in town. I mean, I know we do what we do well, but there are other developers out there who could benefit from teaming up with a service side or service oriented proposal, which would be, I think, very successful. I think we can go on to the next one. I don't want to belabor that developer too much. I know, and I was excited to hear when we first were just chatting, you guys were talking about your land team and how what you're looking to do to sort of outreach. We've had some initial discussions with a few people on this call just about the type of thing the type of land where you could build this. You're looking for something that is close to transportation, close to shopping, not too isolated, because you want to have a situation where people can feel like they're part of a larger community, not just the apartments that you're building, but the overall neighborhood. And I think that we've had some success with that in some of our buildings, and in some buildings, I wish we had done a little bit more to find locations that were more integrated with the community. But some of the ideas that we've seen that have been successful for agencies like yours that are looking for land are some of the things that are on this slide. Sometimes there's municipally owned land that is surplus, that is, has water and sewer and could work. Sometimes there's institutional settings. We've done work in different places with hospitals. We've done work with secondary education, with churches, synagogues. It's sort of open, like the fun part of my job is finding land. And the more you cast a wide net through your board, through people that this is something that I think is really a successful thing. From a community standpoint, no one would know that this is housing that has a special needs component. It looks like market rate housing. It feels like market rate housing where you walk through it. and it feels like market rate housing in the community, meaning that the community ultimately will look at this just like they might look at any other market rate housing that's out there. These are just some ideas that I want you to start thinking about in terms of access to, the proper place where you think this would be successful. Honestly, don't remember what my other slides were. So, Steve, is there anything?
I think that's it for you. I've got this one last slide, Ken.
Sure.
And I just wanted to briefly, finish by showing how these two projects that Ken and Favarh worked at and designed and developed in Connecticut have led to some additional projects. So there are currently 8 total projects in Connecticut, either developed or in development. The first 2, Ken and Favarh developed, and the third was also funded through that seed funding program that I mentioned early. But the last 5 projects are just funded through the low-income housing tax credit program, which is available to New Hampshire as well. So you don't necessarily need that type funding. And as we've said, the program is very popular because it encourages independence, it's cost effective, and it's a better alternative for many people than group homes. And you can just see on the map through the yellow highlights how that's spreading throughout Connecticut, and more will be on the way in 2023 as new proposals go in January.
I think that just to add to that, outside of Connecticut, my company is based in New York. We do a lot of work in this space in New York. And over the last 6 or 7 years, maybe 7 or 8 years at this point, there have been probably 1,500 units of integrated housing that have been built for people with IDD in a larger setting. So it's something that I really feel is a successful model. It doesn't work for every single person with IDD, but it does work for more people than originally was thought when we started doing this type of work. And my first units with IDD go back probably 20 years in the state of New Jersey. And those units, when we did them, no one knew, nobody was doing housing out in the community except for maybe group home setting, which was, in a larger neighborhood, but all isolated. And this is just a wonderful way to have people live in the community and be successful living in the community. I think at this point, Peggy and Laura, if you tell me how you want to move forward, we're certainly open to questions. And I think the more we hear from you, the more things can sort of move towards solutions.
Okay. Thank you so much. I just love it. So I imagine I'm not the only one who's been sitting here writing down questions, but I'll start. How did you get the neighborhoods ready so that you didn't have a NIMBY problem?
So I can speak a little bit to that, and Steve can speak a little bit to that. So grassroots is really very important, and nothing is easy in the business that everybody that we're talking about is in. And I think that one of the first things that we do is we try and go and speak to the neighborhood before we start. Both, not just the governmental folks who are, representing that neighborhood, but the actual people who are living in that neighborhood, because people are nervous. What we've done in some other places that we didn't have to do in Connecticut as much, but we've taken people on tours of existing buildings that are similar to what we are doing or what we're proposing to be done. It's really a collaborative effort, the same way that we collaborate with the funding sources, and the collaboration with the local government and the local community is really crucial. One of the things that we found, and Steve, I'm going to let you take this in a second, is that there's so many people who have some connection to somebody with IDD, whether it be somebody, family, friends, somebody they know from church, somebody they know from government. It's really an asset, a wonderful thing. I mean, it's something that we have been able to benefit from, because when you're in front of a public board or you're in front of a neighborhood and that neighbor or that member of a council or a planning board knows somebody who could benefit from this, or even just knows somebody who has, the same type of issues that we're going to be trying to help folks with, it really is a beneficial thing. It doesn't solve every person's NIMBY issues, and you're never going to solve everybody's NIMBY issues, but if we find the right location and do that grassroots effort, we're going to have a beneficial outcome. One of the issues that, like, we did the housing in Canton, and Steve's organization, Favarh, is very active. Their headquarters is in Canton. People knew them and had a real positive feel for not being steered wrong by that. And Steve, I'll let you talk a little bit more. I'm sorry, because I'll get going and just keep going.
Okay, I think you cover the main points. I think tailoring the strategy towards the particular town and neighborhood that you're going to be building in is key. So in Canton, as Ken mentioned, we held meetings with the neighbors ahead of time, and it's something that you might think about avoiding doing, but addressing it head on, I think really helped us, and it avoided problems down the road that may have can't come up in zoning meetings, for example. We met with the people before the zoning meetings that had questions and concerns. We didn't have as many concerns in Bloomfield, so we didn't have to have those meetings. So tailoring it, I think, is key as well.
Okay, does anybody else have a question?
Yes, this has
Okay.
been,
Okay, Ben.
love hearing what you guys are doing. And thank you so much for taking this time. And I have so many questions. I'm going to try and control myself. I mean, I would love to hear you guys describe, what's in the capital stack and what's in the.
I think Ben froze.
In the meantime,
I can answer that question if you'd like, but I don't know if he can hear, so maybe we want to wait till he gets back.
yeah. Well, let me ask while he's frozen about the sustainability. Do you depend on donations at this point with the established places?
So that's a great question. And I think there's two pieces to that. From the housing standpoint and from the ability to serve the residents that we are building this housing for, we do not need to fundraise. And one of the things that I would say to you, and I said when we first started that we use existing affordable housing resources, just like any other affordable housing developer would use in the state. One of the reasons that we do that is that it's always been my feeling as a developer that you don't want to put a situation together that is dependent on having to collect money every year just to keep open and just to keep serving the population that you want to serve. So the way that these formulas generally have worked is that we've been able to set up a capital stack, and that gets to the question he was talking about, so that with the affordable rents that you're getting, and the residents will pay, in this case, they have rental assistance, so they're paying 30% of their income towards housing, and then the rental assistance pays the rest. With that possibility and with the affordable housing structure that we use, which is low-income housing tax credits plus some soft money from, in this case, the state of Connecticut put up this I-dash money, but there's other funds like that in every state. We set it up so that the project will be a stable and conservatively run, fiscally proper place for many years to come without having to ask for money from anyone. I do want to just talk a little bit and maybe just turn it to Steve for a minute, because on the service side, we've had similar commitments from the state, but I think, Steve, maybe you could just make comment on that and whether you've needed to use any additional monies or. So
we have done some fundraising, but not for the basic service provision. That's in place and that's long term. But we like to do extra things because we want to make this as successful an enterprise as possible. So I mentioned the Healthy Meals program. So to make that affordable to people, we fundraise and we supplement that meal program so that people will buy into it because it's affordable. The recreation programs, sometimes we have to spend money on an art therapist to come in, but we think that's worth it. Those are all enhancements to the living situation. So fundraising only in that respect.
Okay. Anybody else? Maria?
Hi. Are you able to pay your staff a fair wage, livable wage, without fundraising and with the support from the state for the day program piece of it?
Well, that's a loaded question. Fair and livable. Not fair.
Finding staff in the state of New Hampshire, and I think across the country, with rates that that people can live on, that works with a participant's a client's budget.
Yeah, we seem to do a little better than some of our peers throughout the state. Maybe because of the way that we manage. We pay our residential staff $19.25 an hour plus a $2 retention incentive currently. Is that livable? Is it fair? Connecticut is an expensive place to live. We're just hanging on. We have an 18% vacancy rate, which is probably lower than every one of our other peers, but that is still a challenge. I think it always will be.
If I can ask another question, do staff live in any of the other apartments within the complex?
Great question. Not by design, but interestingly, we've had some residents that were living at the complexes and got interested, maybe started volunteering and then applied for jobs. And so in 2 of the complexes, we do have residents that work for us.
Which is, I think, just a wonderful thing. I mean, it says a lot about the agency, Steve's agency, that people would want to buy into this and really are excited about it. But at the same time, it is something that we looked at from the start, that natural support being there. Just we sort of slammed right into, as we opened up right in the middle of the pandemic. So our original plan was to hope to bring some of the existing folks who are providing services through Favarh into the building as residents because they're going to income qualify. It became much more difficult to do because we were filling the building right in the middle of the pandemic, and there was not that, and rightfully so, there was not that excitement to move anywhere new when there was so much new things going on that were not easy to deal with.
Ben, do you want to ask your question again?
Yeah, sorry, guys, I lost internet there. So I wanted to know, Ken, although I know that these were not, at least LIHTC, federal tax credit developments.
They were.
They were?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was confused by that little chart about the developments throughout New Hampshire. So my question was, do you have a rule of thumb for a minimum number of total units to use those tax credits?
So yes, the answer is yes. We did use tax credits on both of these projects. They were 4% tax credits. For those of you who may know, there's 2 different types of tax credits. The 9% tax credits are a little bit more lucrative for the investor, and therefore you don't need as much other resources. These were done as of right with 4% tax credits, and the rule of thumb that we look at is more on the sweet spot for housing for the state where we're working. So and I don't know New Hampshire well enough to tell you, what that is. You may know better than me. But what we generally found in Connecticut was projects between 35 and 45 units of overall housing were projects that were getting funded. and they had limits on the soft money that we also use per project. So it's sort of, from a developer standpoint, you have to sort of fit the desires of that given state based on their competitive process for funding. I think that Steve mentioned a number of units, a number of people, not necessarily a number of units. As 12 people, that was from a service side, something that probably was the minimum. We have done developments with 4 or 5 apartments for people with special needs in them, and the remainder otherwise. But the larger the project, the easier it is for us to be able to fold in this special needs population. Steve mentioned one of my projects in the state of New York, which is just outside of Binghamton, New York, is it's about 108 total apartments, of which 25 of the apartments were set aside for people with IDD. It's been extremely successful in terms of service provision, in terms of the independence that we're talking about. It was easier for us to develop the housing at a building size and a resource amount for that size. But in some states, like in Connecticut, that's a no-go from the start, because the project's too large for the amount of resources that that state has to spread around to multiple different developments to make the most impact.
Thank you, Ken.
Sure.
Lee.
Hi. This is really, really interesting. So within your 40-ish unit complexes, you said you have about 10 or so set aside. Are those spread among the whole building, or are they clustered?
That's a great question. So, Steve, do you want? I don't want to jump in on every question. You want to take it? You want me to just?
Sure, I'll answer that one. We intentionally spread them around because we didn't want to have the Favarh wing, or for example. One thing that we did do strategically was we stacked apartments, and what I mean by that is that, if there's 2 floors, we might put 2 of our apartments right on top of each other, because as we've learned with Ken's help, sound travels more, up and down than side to side in an apartment building. And we're sometimes more tolerant of our own neighbors' noises than they are of us. And so by building some of that into the strategy, it helps us be better neighbors.
So I have an additional question to that, and that is, if we're looking at the CMS rules for people living in a place, I guess maybe it wouldn't be the 1001 rules. I'm not sure. But anyway, we have this whole fire drill problem where we have to have a fire drill once a month. How does the other population handle that?
So we have not had that, unless I'm missing something, Steve. We definitely do fire safety training for people, but we haven't had a fire drill requirement. And it may just be
I'm pretty sure we do fire drills, Ken. Now, I don't think that we do them by setting off the alarm in the building. We do it on a quieter basis, but I do believe we still have to do those.
And so, Steve, it must be quiet enough that I don't know anything about it. But I guess it's not the whole building that participates in that. It's just the folks who are living in the supported units.
Okay. I don't want to monopolize. If anybody else has a question, raise your hand. I do have a question about selection process, and I'm assuming since you are using federal tax credits, et cetera, you have to be using fair housing practices.
Yes.
What do you do? What do you do about that?
So fair housing is we absolutely have to follow fair housing guidelines. There are exceptions to the fair housing rules that say that if you have a service-based preference for housing, in this case, the 10 units or the 9 units or whatever we happen to be talking about, if it is the preference for those apartments is based on people's need for specific services that are available at the complex, then you are legally allowed to say that those 9 or 10 units are able to be rented only to people with disabilities needing those services. And in this case, we're talking about the services being geared for people with IDD. So because those services are available through the complex, you are able to meet the fair housing exceptions that allow for that set aside, that preference. It is something that we work, I do a fair amount of housing for other populations as well. And it's something that we've had HUD come in and say, you're not doing this right. And honestly, we show them that we are doing it right. And it's painful to have them go through the process because they do a whole audit of everything. But it's always been found for us that we've done everything legally. And we spent a lot of time when we first started doing this type of specialty housing to make sure that we were doing things legally and properly. And then I'm sorry, Laura, there was another piece of your question, which I don't know if I.
Well, just the selection process.
Right. So what we generally do, because these are state-funded developments, we generally would run either a first come, first serve lottery type situation. But for the specific special needs units, we work directly with Favarh and in this case, DDS, the Connecticut Department of Developmental Services, for referrals for people who met that fair housing set aside, meaning they had disabilities and they needed the services that are available in the building. The interesting thing about it is that the people have to show that they qualify, but because people have personal choice, somebody could come along, need those services, qualify for the apartment, and not necessarily by fair housing have to take those services, just like in any of your other settings that you're seeing with CMS. But this specific set of units, the 25% of your units that are supported, are sort of dealt with in a slightly different way than the rest of the building. And we meet fair housing despite that.
Okay.
There's a question in the chat about medical assistance and medications and how do we provide those? And so our direct service professionals, we have staff on premises 24/7. And again, not in everybody's apartment that frequently, but on premises for when they're needed. And so for people who need medical procedures or nurse delegated tasks, including medication administration, those direct service professionals or DSPs provide that service.
Lori.
Go ahead,
Okay,
Laura.
sorry. First of all, thank you very much for this. This is so exciting. I could go crazy with questions, but I'm going to try to contain myself. For the direct support professionals that are on site, is there a special place for them set up for like, preparing to assist someone with their medications, or are they just kind of, go from apartment? I know there's communication, stuff like that. Could you just talk a little bit about how that's operationalized?
Sure, we do have staff offices built into
Okay.
each of the complexes, so they operate out of those. And they monitor the apartments through smart technology from the office.
Okay,
And some
thank
of the apartments have medication closets if that's
Yeah.
needed.
Thank you.
Sure. And Lori, I know that you're coming at this from a slightly different angle. If you want to follow up with either of us, we can make ourselves available. But I think this is something that we're really, you can see we're passionate about and excited about, and
Yeah,
it can spread to somewhere else that can benefit. That's what this is about.
excellent. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Are you going to be sharing your slides with Lori so that we can have those if we want to refer to them or share them?
Sure,
Sure.
happy to.
And I just want to say thank you also for doing this. It's been incredibly informative, and I can't thank you both enough for your time.
It's our pleasure. We all live in these silos, especially state-based silos, and it's we benefited from talking to other people around the country, and we're happy to pass that along.
Ken's been doing what he's been doing for 30 years. I've been working with people with IDD for 30 years, and it's fun and exciting to watch the field evolve. And for me, it's about, this is the next thing, right? This is where community living is going. And it's exciting to be at the forefront. And I'm so happy and grateful that I met Ken and at the right time and the right place. And it's fun to see this take off and others get excited. And our ultimate hope is that, people copy what we're doing and improve upon it so that the system keeps evolving and improving.
Absolutely. Every time we do a building, we learn a little bit more about the way to make it more successful. And that's the exciting part. And, the more that you can talk to people that are doing what we're doing, the more beneficial it's going to be for you.
Any last questions before we close?
Lori, this is Susan.
Oh.
Hi.
I see. You're behind my chat.
Yeah, hi. I just wondered if we've talked before about what the challenges to the IDD community are in settings like this. Being in an integrated setting sounds really interesting to me, and I just wondered if that was discussed. I arrived late, and I apologize that, so you might have covered this before. But given your experience with projects like this before, Ken and Stephen, how would you characterize challenges that you see for the population?
Yeah, if I can kind of start on that, I think we learned something from your experience, and in both of our Canton and Bloomfield projects was Ken's recommendation to make an effort to move our residents into the building first. And that was a really powerful strategy, because what it shows people, what it shows the other residents when they arrive, and our residents are already there, is that, they're moving into a setting where this is already established versus our residents moving in later or replacing somebody that moved out, right? And that strategy we found has just worked beautifully.
Yeah, I would add to that because I've seen the negative side of that, which is why I recommended this process. We had a building in New Jersey where we had 20 apartments in about a 100-unit building for seniors. And just unfortunately, the way that it crumbled out was that the people who were moving in that had IDD, there was some delay with the state agency process at the time. And we had basically 80 apartments of seniors who already thought this building was their building, a senior building. And when new people came in who may have looked a little differently from them, may have acted a little differently from them, came in, there was a lot of pushback. And it got to the point where, as an owner, I had to sit down with the tenant association and basically, basically lay down the law and say, this is everyone's building. And ultimately, now it's fine, but there was a good year or two's worth of animosity, which really was unnecessary. And, you can't stop people from thinking what they're going to think, and we all know that. But you can try and work through those things in the most proactive way. I would just add also to answer your question, Susan, that there are definitely times where we have had units where people really couldn't live as independently as we all thought they could live in the start. And it's not been in any of Steve's apartments. I'm thinking specifically of a building I have in Westchester County in New York, that we had somebody who had some had IDD, but also had some coexisting conditions, some mental health conditions that really made it not proper for them to be in this setting. Despite the fact that they had decent support, they ended up sort of turning off that support and shunning it and spiraling in a way from a mental health standpoint that nobody would want to see, and damaging the building, making threats to people in the building. And it's not to say that, I want to say it's not like unique to the IDD population. I have this, we have thousands of apartments, and sometimes people have issues. And just like any other, we try and deal with everybody respectfully and properly. but sometimes things get out of hand. And this was a situation where, you know, I don't know that screening up front would have really helped. It just was sort of an ongoing coexisting situation for that person that it caused them to do things that they shouldn't have been in a public place doing, you know, in an apartment setting. And you know, just it doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen with this population, and it happens outside of this population. It's not like, oh, all people with IDD, that's an issue you have to worry about. It's not. In fact, if anything, we find that the people that we've, you know, have in the buildings that are supported, that have IDD, that have the proper supports, it's just a great tenant for us to have. They're there for a long time. They really enjoy and love being there. If you have an agency like Steve's that encourages the social interaction among everybody in the building, it just becomes a real win-win for the building. And you know, I have that 10 times more than I have the one time where we might have a problem. And I don't want you to, you know, go away thinking this, you know, as long as there's a realism about the families and the people who are moving in about what their ability is to live independently with supports, then things are usually successful.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's that multifaceted approach. It's moving people in early. It's encouraging relationships through integrated recreation activities. It's, you know, staff, you know, conducting themselves in the right way in the building and identifying themselves. And what you find is that, you know, natural supports evolve and develop, and people start looking out for each other. And, you know, our staff will get calls from neighbors saying, I heard a noise next door. Has anyone checked on Betty recently? I just want to make sure she's okay. And so that's when you know things are going well. And like Ken said, things don't always go well. There are problems, but when you create that culture to begin with, problems are much easier to resolve.
Great. Anybody else have a question? All right. Well, I can't thank you enough. This has been really wonderful. And I'm really glad that you might be available for questions on email, because I'm sure we're going to have questions after this. But this has been really wonderful.
It would be my pleasure, and I'm, you know, sure Steve feels.
Absolutely.
This is,
And
you know,
I hope we can do this. Oh, and maybe we'll take a field trip down and visit you down there.
Yeah.
Oh,
we can definitely arrange that. And I think what I would want everybody to go away with is, if you partner with people who do the right thing from an affordable housing, new development standpoint, and that's, I think, really important. You will be able to do this. It's not a difficult lift for families and a service agency if the proper partnerships are put together, whether they be with state agencies, whether they be with a developer. But the more you can make this a collaborative effort, the better it's going to be, the more successful. And I would bring the community into it as well. Like I know that, Lori, we talked about it when we were on the phone just before this call. And I think that the more involved that a community gets and behind this idea, the more successful that development's going to be.
That concludes our presentation. I want to say a big thank you to Ken Regan and Steve Morris for this presentation and for all the work that you do. This is a really great housing model for adults with developmental disabilities. Thank you to everyone who attended our Zoom meeting. Let's hope we can all work together to improve the housing options in New Hampshire. And here's my contact information.